Next presenters are Chris Wiley, Manager, Technical Services, Marine Safety, Transport Canada, and Lauren Thomas, Chief, External Affairs Division, United States Coast Guard, 9th District. Chris and Lauren will discuss how Canada and the United States use domestic regulatory regimes and international conventions to meet the commitments of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement related to preventing threats to the Great Lakes from vessel discharges. People who have met Chris and Lauren know that they are passionate about all things ship and shipping related, and will talk endlessly on this topic if given a chance. Chris, I'm talking about you. And so I'm going to remind the folks of the time limit and ask them to go briskly through their presentation.
I would only point out that I'm off to IMO next week, so the time limit is 6 hours, so I should have lots of time.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Lauren Thomas. That's Chris Wiley. I'm sure we'll do our best to get us back on schedule here. When we were deciding which side of the stage to take, we just talked about should it be by the flags or another matter. I think Chris decided to let me take the clicker since I'm much younger than him and probably a better chance of using it, so here I am. Okay, I'll start out with our purpose. And Annex 5, the Vessel Discharge Annex, is simply focused on preventing harmful discharges from vessels. And this is effected through a combination of our respective countries' regulatory and enforcement regimes. Prevention is the principal focus, but preparing to respond to any releases in order to mitigate environmental impact is a close second. And the 5 areas that I'm talking about are prevention of oil and hazardous substance pollution, garbage, which includes trash and plastic, wastewater and sewage, gray water, black water, and aquatic invasive species, which includes species introduced from ballast water as well as biofouling. To use the vernacular of yesterday's State of the Lake indicators, I would say that we're good and improving.
So, from a practical point of view, as Mike indicated, we're quite passionate about this. I've been doing this for 24 years. But as a result, I've lived through the various iterations of the Water Quality Agreement, and I've also lived the reality of how ships have changed in that. The 1972 agreement reflected the reality that in 1967, there was a ship called the Torrey Canyon that went ashore, and it was the largest ship in the world at the time, and it dumped about 120,000 tons of crude in the Cornwall off of England, and that woke up a lot of people, and it certainly woke up a lot of people here to that. And in Canada, in 1970, you had the SS Arrow, which dumped about 10,000 tons of crude on the East Coast. So not surprisingly, that iteration indicated that oil and hazardous substances were the biggest concern. Similarly, when you went to 1978, surprise, surprise, another one happened. The Amico Cadiz at that point went for 200,000 tons of crude oil into Brittany. So it was appropriate for the concerns of the time. Of note in terms of reality here, there's a picture of at the time, the largest tanker on the Great Lakes, of which I was the second engineer. She was all of 10,000 tons. So worldwide, you had things that were now up to 500,000 tons in terms of carriage of cargo. Fortunately, on the Great Lakes, that hasn't been an issue in the sense that the largest tanker right now on the Great Lakes is about 23,000 tons, so it's only doubled because of the size of the lock and because of the way naval architects have implemented things like double hulling and all the rest of it. It actually decreases the amount of cargo that they can carry, so that the threat is less. But from a practical point of view, the 72, 78, 87 protocols were quite appropriate for the threat that was there, the perceived threat. And in terms of the way that the agencies dealt with it, that's what we focused on. My first job was not ballast water. Surprise, surprise. My first job was to deal with oil and hazardous substances. Still is. Indeed, I was involved with a barge in the Arctic most of this week, and the concern was oil and hazardous substances. So that's it. On the other hand, the one thing that was very different back then as compared to now is that the regional regulatory regime, both in Canada and the U.S., was exactly that. It was regional. We built ships to Great Lakes standards. We had actually world-leading stuff in terms of sewage, but they were Great Lakes sewage pollution prevention. They weren't international standards. They were Great Lakes standards. And in some cases, that was a good thing. We were certainly ahead of the curve. But shipping is a global reality, and global ships come into the Great Lakes. So eventually, that really didn't work. The other thing that was a problem with the first iterations of the Water Quality Agreement was there was some slight indication that we'd actually have to prevent these things, but if you weren't, you had to be able to clean it up, and the ability to actually do that in those times were somewhat minimal. I think we've done a pretty good job, and we'll talk about that a little later.
So as a result of these several of the casualties Chris mentioned and the resulting damage to the environment, the International Maritime Organization swung into action and created numerous conventions addressing safety, security, environmental protection, and response. The first one listed there, SOLAS, Safety of Life at Sea. Fun fact, first iteration of that came in 1914 after a famous sinking in 1912. Then the next significant one was MARPOL, which is short for Prevention of Pollution from Ships. This regulates the bulk transportation of oil and noxious liquid substances, which is a hazardous material. There's also a convention on packaged hazardous materials, and it also regulates the discharge of garbage, sewage, and even vessel engine emissions. So MARPOL is probably the most comprehensive out of all the conventions that have come out of IMO. Other notable ones, standards for training and certification of watchkeeping, which is again establishing competency training levels for our merchant seamen around the world. International Convention for Safe Containers, again, focus on packaged hazardous material. And then the Rules of the Road, which is also known as coal rigs. And after these conventions came out, both our countries basically passed laws that implemented these treaties that they were signatory to, and also passed additional laws in areas that needed attention. On the U.S. side, we had Port and Water Safety Act of 1972, Port and Tanker Safety Act of 78, OPA 1990, most of you have heard about that one, National Invasive Species Act of 1996, and then the Maritime Transportation Security Act 2002 after 9/11. So on the Canadian side, they're much more efficient than our government. They implemented the Canadian Shipping Act of 2001 and got it all done with one act. So no comment there. So as a result of since the 1980s, there's been a lot of legislation and a lot of follow-on regulations to essentially regulate the risk of a discharge or an accident in the maritime transportation mode to very, very low levels.
So from a practical point of view, as Lauren has said, we have gone from a regional regime to an international regime put in place by domestic legislation. That's important for us in the sense that we're not a science organization, we're not an environmental organization, we regulate ships. And yes, we're passionate about it, but it also reflects the reality of how shipping has changed. I started sailing in the late 70s, and it's amazing the types of ships, the kinds of ships, the amount of change in terms of automation, design, the whole concept of double hulling of tankers, for example, is huge in terms of naval architect and marine engineering. the kinds of engines that are out there. We now have and if you watch, if you look at some of the ships, there's not too many come into the Toronto anymore, but if you go down to the Welland Canal or you go into the connecting channels, you can watch these things go by, and the kind of ships that come in, the types of ships that you see, they have been replaced by very modern. The average age of the vessel that is now coming into the Great Lakes is about 8 years old. My first chief engineer's job was built in 1887, and it's still sailing. So we have a dichotomy there in terms of how things are going. But the other issue is that we also share these things. So the London Dumping Convention, for example, our friends at Environment Canada help us with that. The Pollution Prevention and Response Convention, well, that is actually morphed in terms of the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement into what we deal with in terms of canyon slack. And canyon slack is our joint binational response. Not only is it in the agreement, but it is based on the international reality these days. And so we exercise that. There is a full-scale exercise that happened with respect to Enbridge and Moortown in regards to concerns from the public about the ability to clean up spills from not ships but from pipelines. We had 70 people involved real time in an incident command situation there. We also did desktop planning. We actually, there is, as we speak, a whole coastal strategy that's going to look at more emphasis on environmental response in terms of Transport Canada to allow us to better make sure that not only are we operational, we have very, very, very few spills in the Great Lakes, and they are in liters rather than tons. But we do need to be available to respond to things when and if they happen.
Just moving on to the progress over the last 3 years, and this is a continuing process. Our Canadian, our joint port state and flag state inspection program has ensured compliance with these international standards and our respective suite of regulations. Flag state is U.S. inspecting its U.S. flag operators. Canada, Transport Canada are inspecting and certifying the Canadian flagships. And we both have a port state control program for the foreign flagships that come into our respective ports. We go on board and make sure they're complying with the international conventions and the regulations specific to the Great Lakes. They're signatory to these conventions. We trust, but we also like to verify, and we both do that in our respective waters as these ships visit our ports around the Great Lakes. Over the past 3 years, the agencies with responsibilities for implementing Annex 5, which is the Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard, Transport Canada, Canadian Coast Guard, DFO, and EPA, have monitored these prevention-focused regulatory and compliance programs. And as I mentioned, I think we've mitigated the risk of a discharge harmful to the Great Lakes to a very low standard, to a very low level, excuse me. But also I have to recognize that as a result of our very, very responsible and compliant domestic and foreign flag operators that work on and call on the Great Lakes, they've contributed greatly to the success of the program for the last 3 years. As Chris mentioned, we don't have a lot of spills in the Great Lakes. Fortunately, if we do, they're small, but we have to have plans in case something big happens. It's pretty well known we still have some challenges out there with respect to responding to oil that sinks. As you know, oil that spills on salt water, most of it floats. Fresh water, it's gonna some of the heaviest oil. And again, none of this is being carried right now on any ships in the Great Lakes, but if it was carried on the Great Lakes, it would sink some of the heavier oils that could possibly be moved in the Great Lakes. So we have a work group actually looking at that in case that happens. Again, no indication that's going to happen. Also, we have ice part of the year on the Great Lakes, and there are certainly some challenges responding to any oil spills on ice-covered lakes or lakes that are partially covered with ice. So ice recoveries, oil spill recovery is a very mechanical process, very, very labor intensive. So with ice in the way, again, that becomes more difficult. It doesn't come impossible, but so there's a lot of R&D going on right now. In fact, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative money to the Coast Guard, a good part of that has been funding some R&D for some applied research towards solving some of those problems and increasing the efficiency of our oil spill skimming capability in an ice-rich environment during the wintertime. Back to you, Chris.
Well, I'm the ballast water guy, and ballast water still remains our key problem, not only on the Great Lakes, but worldwide. It's mostly perception in terms of the Great Lakes. And DFO has done some excellent work in terms of identifying the problem. Basically, 59 of the identified sources of invasive species to the Great Lakes were directly attributable to ships and discharge from ballast water. As Gavin indicated, we were getting an amazing number that were coming in. We did a lot of work with the University of Windsor, with NOAA, to identify why, despite putting things in place in 1989, and very much thanks to the IJC in terms of pushing that issue, we had guidelines. We had mandatory things from regulations since 1993, and yet we were still getting things in. The NOBOB issue in terms of the little sediments on the bottom was actually a big surprise that something maybe 2 inches thick was actually still contributing to the source of invasion on the Great Lakes. Well, we solved that. We required them to do exchange or an equivalent of exchange in terms of flushing their tanks. And we put that in law in 2006. And we now, through the 4 agencies, as in the Transport Canada, the DFO providing science, and NOAA providing the science, the U.S. Coast Guard, and both seaways, we look at 100% of the ships that come in from outside the exclusive economic zone. We inspect and test 100% of the tanks on these ships. And that has allowed, and DFO has come back and told us that we've done a pretty good job. We haven't had an invasive species attributable to ships' ballast water since 2006. Is it perfect? Well, we will find out. The Ballast Water Convention has come into force, or will come into force in a year. I happen to chair the IMO working group on the Ballast Water Convention. So on September the 8th, 2017, the Ballast Water Convention will be into force. That will eventually go from exchange to a treatment standard, 10 little organisms of various classes, but it will mean technology will take over in terms of how we're going to fight things. Have we got challenges? Absolutely. As Gavin indicated, there are issues with the domestic regime. We're going to have to deal with them at the high level, and right now Canada and the US are already in discussions to how we're going to do that. Last week I brought the head of MEPC, the Marine Environmental Protection Committee at IMO, to Montreal to actually look at that system. And he's from Panama, and Panama is the world's largest flag state. And they've expressed an interest on bringing their whole regulatory regime in light of what we have done binationally on the Great Lakes. It's a great success, and the world looks to the Great Lakes, and I will say to the Great Lakes. It's not Canada, it's not US, it's to the Great Lakes to lead them ahead on the ballast water front. And I'm hoping there'll be continued success in terms of how the convention is implemented.
And the last slide here shows our priorities for the next couple of years. And again, as Chris had mentioned, Coast Guard and Transport Canada and eventually EPA will be discussing how we're going to be implementing the Ballast Water Convention, especially here on the Great Lakes, where Canada is signatory and the U.S. is not. However, our ballast water discharge standard rulemaking is very, very similar to the convention, but it's not exact. So those priorities that we've laid out here for action support the ongoing discussions that are going to take place over the next couple of years on how we're going to do that. Make sure we're trying to align our systems. When I say us, I'm talking about the Coast Guard and EPA as well, because the vessel general permit would still apply on the Great Lakes. Try to get those compatible and as aligned and supported by the same set of facts as possible as we implement the rest of our rulemaking, and also as Canada implements their rulemaking to support the convention. And that's all we had.
Thank you.